You walk down a quiet street in the Fairgrounds neighborhood of New Orleans. It's early evening. The air carries the scent of magnolia and gumbo from a nearby kitchen. Porch lights glow amber. Someone's radio plays a faint second line beat. You hear a door chime, a laugh, then silence. What happens in the space between a normal moment and a life altered forever? On the evening of January 20, 2026, two adults in the Fairgrounds neighborhood experienced that threshold. Their names, out of respect for families awaiting formal identification processes, remain pending coroner confirmation. But their stories, their routines, their connections, the quiet rhythms of their lives matter. Because understanding what broke in those final moments isn't about spectacle. It's about safeguarding. It's about asking, what would you do if you heard that silence? This is not a story of gore. It's a story of patterns, of the subtle shifts that precede crisis, of how communities heal when trust feels fractured, and of the psychological questions that linger long after police tape comes down. What makes a safe space feel unsafe? How do we recognize distress in others and in ourselves before it escalates? What safeguards exist now that didn't exist then? You're not just watching a documentary, you're stepping into a conversation, one that asks, if you lived on that street, what would you notice? What would you do? And how do we build neighborhoods where quiet means peace, not vulnerability? Before January 20th, the Fairgrounds neighborhood was what many New Orleans residents call a pocket of calm. Not tourist-heavy like the French Quarter, not bustling like the Bywater, just home. Residents knew each other's dogs. They borrowed cups of sugar. They waved from porches at dusk. The two individuals at the center of this investigation were part of that fabric. While official identification processes remain ongoing, community members have shared glimpses of lives lived with intention. One was known for tending a small front yard garden, tomatoes, basil, a stubborn rosemary bush that survived last winter's freeze. The other volunteered with a local literacy program, helping neighbors practice English in a borrowed church basement on Tuesday evenings. Their routines were ordinary: morning coffee, evening walks, checking mail. These aren't just details, they're psychological anchors. When violence disrupts routine, the trauma isn't only about the event itself, it's about the loss of predictability, the shattering of "this is my safe place." Psychologists call this environmental mastery, the belief that we can navigate our surroundings with reasonable confidence. When that belief fractures, recovery isn't just physical, it's cognitive, emotional. It requires rebuilding trust in space itself. Consider this: what did these two people lose forever beyond their lives? They lost the assumption that home is sanctuary. They lost future Tuesdays teaching vocabulary, future sunsets watering rosemary, future moments of quiet connection on a porch swing. And what did their community lose? Not just two neighbors, but a layer of unspoken trust, the assumption that nothing bad happens here. That assumption, once broken, requires conscious rebuilding. This is where our psychological focus begins, not with whodunit, but with what does it take to restore a sense of safety after it's been violated, and more importantly, what subtle signs might have preceded this crisis, and how can communities learn to respond with compassion, not fear? Research in environmental psychology shows that neighborhoods with strong informal surveillance, not spying but natural, caring awareness, experience lower rates of violent escalation. It's not about suspicion, it's about connection. The neighbor who notices a car idling too long, the shop owner who recognizes a familiar face looking distressed, the friend who texts, "You okay? Haven't seen you on your walk." These aren't investigative tactics, they're human habits, and they matter. On the evening of January 20, 2026, NOPD received a call reporting a disturbance in the Fairgrounds neighborhood. Officers arrived to find two adults with fatal injuries. Medical personnel pronounced them deceased at the scene. The investigation began immediately. What follows is reconstructed from publicly available police statements, community reports and psychological pattern analysis. No graphic details, no speculation about motive, only what serves understanding. The timeline suggests a convergence of factors, a location, a moment, and an interaction that escalated beyond repair. Investigators are examining digital footprints, witness accounts, and environmental cues. But here's what psychology teaches us about escalation. Violence rarely emerges from nowhere. It follows pathways. Stressors accumulate. Warning signs flicker, often missed, often misunderstood. Let's pause. Before we discuss investigation, let's discuss prevention. Because the most powerful question isn't who did this. It's what could have interrupted this pathway. Psychologists studying community violence identify three recurring patterns in quiet crisis scenarios. The isolation spiral. Individuals experiencing psychological distress often withdraw. They skip regular gatherings. They stop returning texts. They become hard to reach. This isn't always intentional. Depression, anxiety, trauma, they shrink a person's world. And when someone shrinks from community, early intervention becomes harder. The normalization of distress. In close-knit neighborhoods, we sometimes mistake concerning behavior for just how they are. He's always been quiet. She's been stressed lately. These observations aren't wrong, but without a framework for compassionate follow-up, they become passive. Psychology calls this bystander ambiguity. We see something off, but we're unsure if it's our place to act. The threshold moment. Most violent escalations include a point of no return, a decision, an action, a word that shifts possibility into inevitability. What makes that threshold crossable? Often, perceived threat, emotional flooding, or the collapse of coping resources. Understanding these triggers isn't about excusing harm. It's about identifying intervention points. So ask yourself, if you noticed a neighbor withdrawing, what would you do? Text, knock on the door, call a non-emergency community liaison. There's no single right answer, but having a plan, a personal protocol for compassionate check-ins, changes the landscape of prevention. Now, let's discuss how investigators approach this work. Because rebuilding truth after violence is both forensic and psychological. Detectives don't just collect evidence, they reconstruct narratives. They ask, what was the victim's last known location? Who saw them? What digital traces exist? But they also ask psychological questions. What was the emotional tone of recent interactions? Were there unresolved conflicts, signs of distress? This dual approach, physical evidence plus behavioral pattern, is critical because motive isn't always rational. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's impulsive. Sometimes it's the tragic convergence of multiple stressors. NOPD's investigation follows established protocols, scene documentation, witness interviews, forensic analysis. But they also collaborate with victim advocates, mental health professionals, and community liaisons. Why? Because solving a crime isn't only about apprehension. It's about healing. It's about ensuring the community doesn't just get answers, it gets support. Within hours of the incident, Fairgrounds residents gathered for an impromptu vigil. Candles, flowers, shared silence. This wasn't performative, it was psychological first aid. Research on collective trauma shows that communal rituals, vigils, memorials, shared meals, serve critical functions. They restore a sense of agency. They validate grief. They rebuild connection. One resident shared, "We don't have answers yet, but we have each other." That statement isn't just comforting, it's protective. Social connection is a documented buffer against trauma's long-term effects. But community response also raises complex questions. How do we balance transparency with privacy? How do we support families without intruding? How do we honor victims without defining them by their final moments? These aren't easy questions, but asking them thoughtfully, respectfully, is part of ethical storytelling and part of ethical community. Let's go deeper. What actually breaks in scenarios like this, not just physically, psychologically? Three frameworks help us understand. The stress response curve. Everyone has a threshold. Chronic stress, financial strain, relationship conflict, health concerns, elevates baseline anxiety. Add an acute trigger and the system can overload. This isn't justification, it's explanation. Understanding the curve helps us recognize when someone might be nearing their limit and how to offer support before crisis. The empathy gap. In moments of high emotion, our capacity for perspective-taking shrinks. We see threat, not context. We react, not reflect. This gap isn't moral failure, it's neurobiology, but it's also trainable. Mindfulness practices, conflict resolution skills, emotional literacy, these aren't soft skills, they're protective infrastructure. The narrative collapse. After trauma, our internal story, I am safe. The world is predictable, can fracture. Recovery isn't about returning to before. It's about constructing a new narrative that integrates loss without being defined by it. This is hard work. It requires time, support, and often professional guidance. So when we ask what broke here, we're not seeking a villain. We're seeking understanding, because understanding is the foundation of prevention. Pause. Imagine you're walking home that evening. You notice something unusual, a tense conversation, a door left open, a voice raised. What do? Options aren't binary. You don't have to choose between intervene directly and ignore completely. There's a spectrum. Text a neighbor. Call NOPD's non-emergency line to report concern. Reach out to a community liaison you trust. Simply bear witness and later offer support to those affected. Psychology calls this pro-social bystander behavior. It's not about heroism, it's about humane awareness, and it's a skill we can practice. Ask yourself, what's your personal protocol? Write it down, share it with a friend. Because when crisis emerges, we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to our level of preparation. As of this recording, the NOPD investigation remains active. No suspect information has been publicly released. This is intentional. Investigations require space. Families require privacy. And justice requires patience. But justice isn't only legal. It's also communal. It's also psychological. So what does healing look like in the Fairgrounds neighborhood? First, restoring routine. Neighbors are returning to evening walks. Gardens are being tended. Literacy programs continue. This isn't denial, it's resilience. Routine is psychological scaffolding. It helps us rebuild a sense of predictability. Second, creating dialogue. Community leaders are hosting listening sessions, not to assign blame, not to speculate, but to process, to ask, how do we care for each other better? These conversations aren't easy, but they're essential. Third, implementing safeguards. What concrete steps can neighborhoods take? Research suggests establishing neighbor check-in networks that are voluntary and respectful, partnering with local mental health resources for community education, creating clear, non-emergency pathways for reporting concern, training community members in trauma-informed response. These aren't surveillance tactics, they're connection strategies, and they work. Let's zoom out. What has changed in New Orleans and nationwide since similar incidents in the past? More officers receive specialized training in de-escalation, mental health awareness, and trauma response. This doesn't prevent every tragedy, but it changes outcomes. Many districts now employ dedicated liaisons who bridge communication gaps. They're not investigators, they're connectors, and they matter. Apps that allow anonymous concern reporting, neighborhood alert systems with privacy safeguards, resource directories for mental health support. These tools empower without frightening. Urban planners increasingly consider psychological safety, lighting, sightlines, communal spaces that encourage natural connection. Design isn't neutral, it shapes behavior. But tools alone aren't enough. Culture matters, and culture shifts when we choose compassion over fear, when we ask, how can I help, before who's to blame, when we recognize that safety isn't the absence of risk, it's the presence of connection. We return to the heart of this story. Not the crime, not the investigation, the people. What did these two individuals lose forever? Beyond their lives, future moments of joy, unspoken words, unlived dreams, the quiet satisfaction of a garden tended, the pride of a student learning to read, the comfort of a shared meal. And what did their loved ones lose? The certainty of tomorrow, the sound of a familiar voice, the assumption of safety. Acknowledging this loss isn't morbid, it's human, and it's necessary, because when we center victims not as statistics but as people, we honor their humanity, and we clarify our purpose, not to sensationalize, but to safeguard. So ask yourself, how do we honor their memory? By building neighborhoods where quiet means peace, where connection is practice, not accident, where intervention is compassionate, not intrusive, where healing is possible. We began with a question. What happens in the space between a normal moment and a life altered forever? We don't have all the answers. Investigations continue. Families grieve, communities heal. But we have this understanding, compassion, commitment. If you walk down that fairground street tonight, what would you notice? The magnolia scent, the porch lights, the quiet, and now perhaps a deeper awareness, not fear, not suspicion, but mindful connection. Because safety isn't built by walls, it's built by webs, webs of care, of awareness, of willingness to ask, "You okay?" So here's my invitation to you, reflect. What's one small action you could take this week to strengthen connection in your own community? A text, a wave, a resource shared, prepare. What's your personal protocol for compassionate concern? Write it down, share it. Support. If this story resonated, consider donating to New Orleans-based victim support organizations or simply hold space for someone grieving. This isn't the end of the story. It's a continuation. Because every neighborhood, every street, every porch light is part of a larger tapestry, and we all hold threads. Thank you for watching with care, for listening with compassion, for choosing understanding over spectacle. If you found this documentary helpful, please subscribe to Quiet Crime Stories. We produce calm, ethical, victim-centered true crime content, because insight matters more than shock. And now I leave you with the question we began with. What would you do?